All right, so this is the high place of Dan. Folks, this is a spectacular find. Now we got to set the scene. Down there we were talking about the period of the judges. The last judge was Samuel. Samuel did so well that the people said, make us a king. He made him a king. That was Saul. I like to say that the period of the judges that we contemplated a little bit before was God's way to teach Israel they needed a king. The reign of Saul was God's way to teach Israel they need a righteous king. And God brings him to that place, and so then he gives him David. David dies and passes the kingdom to Solomon. Solomon dies, and I like to say I believe that Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs originally as a wisdom curriculum for his son Rehoboam to teach him how to grow up into manhood and how to be a good king. Unfortunately, how to be a wise king. But evidently, Rehoboam slept through some of the lessons, if you know what I mean, because as soon as Rehoboam becomes king, he does foolishly. 10 tribes of the north say, lighten up. Rehoboam goes to his aged counselors, and they say, you better listen. He goes to his young counselors. The Bible is explicit, the ones he had put in office. And they said, you better show him who's boss right now. And so you remember Rehoboam said, my little finger is thicker than my daddy's thigh. My father whipped you with whips. I'm going to whip you with scorpions. And 10 tribes said, we're done. And they started their own kingdom. Now there was a general in Rehoboam's army by the name of Jeroboam. And Jeroboam had been told by a prophet that he was going to be made king of 10 of the tribes. And so, and the Bible says that God allowed the stubbornness and foolishness of Rehoboam in order to get this done. So now you have 2 kingdoms. One in the north, it's called Israel in the Bible. Its capital is going to be moved from Shechem to Tirzah to Samaria. And it's going to have a whole succession of kings, actually 19 kings and 7 different dynasties. But the first king is Jeroboam. So now one of the first acts of Jeroboam is this. First of all, he built Shechem as a king, as his kingdom. And then he said this, verse 26 of 1 Kings 12. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, which is exactly what God demanded of them, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They'll kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And therefore the king asked advice. Now, evidently, he and or his advisors have been having their devotions, if you don't mind, in Exodus, and they read the passage about the golden calves back there and thought that was a pretty good idea. I don't know how you get there. But at any rate, his advisors said this, make 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Why should your, take up your air mattress, like I say? Why should your religion cost you that much? Go all the way down to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I want to come back to that verse. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin for the people, because they went to worship before the one as far as Dan. Now, 2 things real quickly. Number 1, Jeroboam's middle name in the Bible is who made Israel to sin. Again and again, when it's referred to Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. That's how, you don't want that necessarily on your tombstone, but that's what goes on his tombstone. I want to think carefully, and this is just Bookman talking to you, but I want to think rather carefully about what his sin was. Because, well, and part of the confusion or the issue is what he says. He says in verse 28, here are your gods. So imagine him here. And by the way, this is where the golden calf sat. All right, this is huge. They've uncovered the high place of Dan. You're standing at it. The golden calf would be up here. This is where the altar was. Now, surprise, that's not the original altar, okay? But they found remnants of those horns, one of those horns. Now, a horn, an altar in antiquity, for whatever reason, well, I think we know the reason, but it would usually be decorated on the 4 corners by these little sort of stylized horns, because power was resident in the horns of an animal, and so the idea was the authority and the power was sort of put on display, and they found remnants of one of those, and from that they calculated approximately how big it would have been, and almost certainly would have been there, and there were installations, and they've dug all around here and so on. We'll come back to that. But so this is where the high place was. So you imagine Jeroboam right here. Here are your gods, O Israel. Now, here's part of the problem. It sounds like it's deliberately pagan. He's abandoning Yahweh. He's embraced polytheism. I don't believe he had. And I think you would be better off to translate it, here is your God. And by the way, there's no verb. It's just, behold your God. Does that make sense to you? But in the Hebrew, it's behold your gods. But does he mean gods in the sense he's embraced polytheism, or is he saying behold your God? He goes on to say, behold your God, which brought you up out of, that's Yahweh. And I'm convinced, here's where I'm taking you. Archaeologists have dug here, and they have found pits of animal bones that are clearly the remnant of sacrifice. Have I talked to you about this before? And the curious reality is that, number one, there are no pig bones. But number two, and this is even more instructive, there are almost no right shoulder bones of the animals. Because in Leviticus, the right shoulder bone, that portion was to be given to the priest. So there is clear evidence that these people were being careful about Leviticus. They were, I think these are Yahweh's. If you'd have stopped Jeroboam and said, have you abandoned? Absolutely not. I have not. That's why I like to say Jeroboam defied the second commandment. Thou shalt make no graven images. But he had no intention whatever to defy the first commandment. And it's interesting that later on, when Ahab and Jezebel come along, remember we read that, it says as if it were a trivial thing to do what Jeroboam did. So it puts distance. He went on and married Jezebel, and they tried it. And then, I didn't read this to you, but in 2 Kings chapter 10, when Ahab wipes out, matter of fact, I will read it to you. Remember Ahab, the king who, not Ahab, Jehu, the king, the general who was deputized to wipe the house of Ahab, and he does that and puts an end to Baalism there in Israel, at least for that crisis. But it's interesting that in telling that story, 2 Kings chapter 10, it says this, thus Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. Now listen to this. However, Jehu did not turn from the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. So the Bible rather carefully distinguishes between the sin of Jeroboam, which I think is a defiance of the second commandment, but they still are insisting that they're Yahweh's, and the sin of Ahab, who took it another step and set out to defy the first commandment. I think that's an important distinction in many ways, but one of the ways is this, and I'll just read one verse and we'll be done. It says, he set up, I'm back in 1 Kings chapter 12, and it says that Jeroboam set up one in Bethel and the other in Dan. By the way, Bethel is on the southern border of the northern kingdom, just north of Jerusalem, but that's in the south. So you got one up here in the north, Dan, one in the south, Dan and Bethel. And these two, the one in Bethel has not been found. But anyway, here's the point. He set up one in Bethel and the other in Dan. It became a sin, but listen to this. He also made shrines on the high places. He made priests from every class of people who were not the sons of Levi. So once you start caving in, once you compromise, not only did he have these places, then he also had some high places. Okay, you got this, might as well go to the next further. And that's the way it works. You start to, you get selective about your obedience. I'm really going to be loyal to this. This I don't think is that important. And tomorrow there's something else you don't think is very important. So, and like I say, it was as wicked as it could be, and that's how he's remembered.